That night, the wind possessed a biting soul. It howled through the imperceptible wounds in the cabin's cedar skin. A phantom slipping past the weather stripping Marcus Thompson had sworn to mend 3 summers ago, and it made a home in Sarah Chen's bones. A cold guest with no intention of leaving. She was but 17 years and had walked this world alone for 8 long months. Ever since the sky had claimed the Cessna that carried her parents into the heart of the Cascade Range, a secret the mountains decided they would keep forever. She stood as a silhouette against the kitchen window, her gaze lost where the ponderosa pines grew in a thicket so dense they drank the moonlight from the sky. The sanctuary her father had raised with his own hands rested at 7,200 feet, a world away from the distant glow of Bend, yet tethered to civilization by a Forest Service road that only yielded its passage to a truck with the grit to tame its scars. Sarah had her father's old Ford, a machine that seemed to run on a blend of stubborn memory and whispered prayers, much like the very rhythm of her own life. It was the silence of the chimes on the porch that first stole her attention, not a sound, but the hallowed space where one used to be. Her father had strung them there in a forgotten year, when Sarah was 8 or 9, a time when his forest fables were still gospel. They were not the polished, melodic kind born in a gift shop, but a congregation of keys, dozens of them, rusted and orphaned, threaded on fishing line from origins unknown, hanging as a strange, silent ode to all the doors that were no longer locked. When a breeze stirred them, they did not so much chime as they did conspire in hushed, metallic tones, a conversation that had woven itself into the very fabric of her childhood. Her mother once mused, they sounded like bells from a distant town. Her father claimed they sounded like the voice of memory itself. To Sarah, they had always sounded like loneliness, a truth she had kept locked away in the quiet chambers of her own heart. And now, their whispered song had ceased. She pressed her palm to the frigid pane of glass, her breath a fleeting cloud that obscured her view of the world outside. The wind still danced its relentless ballet. She could see its work in the deep bow of the branches, in the way the sparse November snow rose and fell like a legion of restless spirits, and yet the keys offered no sound in reply. Sarah reached for the Coleman lantern that stood sentinel on the kitchen table. The cabin held a tenuous pact with electricity, a courtesy of a generator that obeyed its own whims, but she had granted it an early slumber this night to conserve what little fuel remained. The lantern's glow was a warmer companion anyway, a soft light that persuaded the shadows to feel less like watchful eyes. She slipped into her father's old Carhartt jacket, a garment that still held the faint, sacred ghost of him after all these months, a trinity of motor oil, pine pitch, and the unspoken essence of a man who conversed more with wildlife patterns than with people. The porch boards groaned a familiar protest beneath her boots. At 17 years of age, she already carried herself with the deliberate grace of someone far older, someone who had learned that sound could be a betrayer, and that silence was a language that spoke volumes. The cold air met her face with a sting that felt both sharp and alive. November in the high Cascades was a force that made no apologies. By December, this place would be entombed in white, and she had perhaps one final pilgrimage for supplies before the snows rendered the road a memory until the spring thaw. The keys hung in a state of suspended animation within the porch overhang sanctuary, shielded from the gale that tore across the clearing. Sarah lifted the lantern, its golden light painting the scene. The fishing line that held the lowest key had been severed. It was not frayed by the patient hand of weather, nor broken by the strain of time. It was cut with a clean, deliberate precision, as if a blade had delivered a final, silent word. The very air in her lungs seemed to freeze. She moved to the precipice of the porch, the lantern held high like a torch, and it was then that she saw it. 30 yards distant, just beyond the fortress of firewood her father had built 3 summers past, and that she had been slowly deconstructing ever since. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. It was not a bear. She knew the soul of a bear had witnessed enough of them to recognize their form, their lumbering grace, the way they moved like liquid shadow poured into a vessel of fur. This was not that. This being stood upright. It was tall, taller than any man she had ever laid eyes on, and she knew the measure of tall men. Her father had been 6'3", and his research partner, Jake Williams, had towered even over him. This presence would have made them seem like boys. Its shoulders were a testament to impossible strength, broad enough to suggest it might move fallen trees for sport, yet they tapered to hips that were almost human in their form, but utterly alien in their scale. And its face, a mystery half veiled in shadow, caught just enough of the lantern's glow for Sarah to discern that it was not snarling, nor threatening, nor posturing in any of the ways a predator announces its intent. It was simply bearing witness. A part of her mind, the part that was the heir to her mother's doctorate in wildlife biology and her father's meticulous discipline in the field, began to weave a tapestry of data. Height, perhaps 8 feet, maybe 9. Stance, bipedal. Its weight settled with a human-like grace, but with a gravity that spoke of something more. Proximity, approximately 30 yards. Threat assessment, an unknown quantity. But the other part of her, the part nurtured on her father's whispered tales of the ancient forest and the beings who dwelled there long before roads and rangers and GPS coordinates tried to tame the wild, that part of her knew with a deep and resounding certainty precisely what she was beholding. A tide of terror should have consumed her. Every film, every story, every primal instinct hardwired into her soul screamed to run, to cry out, to seize the shotgun her father kept as a silent guardian above the mantel. Yet Sarah remained rooted to the spot. She could not move. And more strangely still, she did not want to. For the being that watched her from the tree line, and she knew now with an unshakable conviction that it was watching times her asterisk, not just the space she occupied, but truly seeing her, knowing her, it did not radiate menace. It felt like a solemn promise. It felt like all those childhood moments when she had sensed unseen eyes upon her in the woods, and her father had calmly reassured her, "That's just the guardian. There is nothing to fear." It felt like all those mornings she had awoken to find the porch inexplicably swept clean of pine needles, and her father had simply smiled and said, "See? We are not alone out here." The figure took a single, deliberate step backward into the embrace of the woods, and Sarah blinked. When her vision cleared, it had vanished. It had not fled. It had not crashed through the undergrowth as a bear would have. It was simply gone. It had been reclaimed by the profound darkness between the trees, as if it were nothing more than a mirage woven from shadow and moonlight. But the severed fishing line still danced in a wind that had suddenly rediscovered its voice, and the keys, awakened from their slumber, began to sing their whispering hymn once more. And Sarah Chen, standing on that porch, cloaked in her dead father's jacket, came to understand with a clarity that transcended all logic that her parents had been protecting something far greater than just their daughter. They had been the keepers of a sacred trust, something the forest had confided in them. And now that sacred duty had passed to her. She retreated back into the warmth of the cabin, the act of locking the door more a ritual of habit than a belief in its power, and sat at the kitchen table with her mother's time-worn field journal. The final entry, penned just 2 days before the crash, consisted of only 3 words in her mother's elegant, precise script. It came closer. Listen, there is something you must grasp before this story carries us any further. This is not some tale spun around a campfire designed to make you check the locks on your doors an extra time. This is the testament of Sarah Chen, a 17-year-old girl, made an orphan by the vast, indifferent sky and appointed by circumstance to a guardianship she never sought. What unfolded next is not the stuff of fiction. It is a matter of record. Sheriff Tyler Martinez holds the reports. The Forest Service is in possession of the photographs. And somewhere, tucked away in a filing cabinet in Bend, Oregon, exists a case file bearing a classification that silently warns, "Do not ask." But before we delve into those depths, before I recount the story of the men who came searching for what they believed was hidden within that mountain cabin, and the night Sarah's quiet existence was irrevocably transformed, I ask you for a simple favor. Press that subscribe button. This channel is a sanctuary for true stories, the kind that gently compel you to question the very boundaries of the world you think you know. And believe me, after you hear the rest of Sarah Chen's journey, you will want to remain a part of this one. And so, let us speak of what came to pass 2 weeks after Sarah met the gaze of the figure in the trees. The last vestiges of autumn had been devoured by the approaching winter by the time Derek Callahan arrived in Bend, carrying a manila envelope and a narrative that reeked of inherited wealth and ill-gotten intentions. He was 62, with the softness about his middle that settles on men who have forsaken physical labor, but not the appetite that accompanies it, and he wore a Carhartt jacket that was too crisp and hiking boots that had never known the kiss of a true trail. He took a room at the Pine Lodge Motel on Highway 97, and for 3 days, he steeped himself in the local bars and diners asking his questions. Questions that orbited the memory of Marcus Thompson and Linda Chen, questions that probed into the heart of their research, questions that sought to uncover if they had left behind any fortune, any insurance, any earthly thing of value to be plundered from that solitary cabin on Waseda Mountain. The townspeople, in their quietly resolute way, suggested he go find his answers in the sand. The folks in Bend are a welcoming sort when you're sharing a beer and discussing the day's powder, but when you begin to pry into the lives of their departed neighbors, you discover that the well of mountain hospitality runs only so deep. Derek Callahan, however, seemed immune to their silent dismissal. He wore the expression of a man thoroughly convinced of his own superior intellect, a man who had long ago decided that the rules of the world were meant for lesser people. He was not a solitary predator. 3 days after Callahan's arrival, two other men materialized. Connor Hayes, 38, was a man whose past included a stay in Salem for armed robbery back in the 90s. He had emerged in 2004, professing a reformed life, taking construction work where he could. He was built like a man who had spent a lifetime lifting heavy burdens, and his eyes held the cold calculus of someone who had spent just as long weighing the decision to cause others harm. The third man was younger, perhaps 30, with a face that seemed untouched by the need to ever truly work for anything. His name was Brandon Walsh, and as Sheriff Tyler Martinez, a man who made it his business to know every soul passing through his county, would later confirm, he was Callahan's nephew. A wealthy boy playing a dangerous game, shielded his entire life from consequence by the fortress of his father's money. They convened at the Pine Lodge on a Thursday evening, cloistered within the drawn curtains of Derek's room. For 3 hours, their voices murmured. The motel's owner, Emma Rodriguez, recalled the sound as she made her rounds, a low hum that seeped through the door. It wasn't the words she heard, but the intent behind them. They were architects of a plan. It was the sound men make when they are talking themselves into an act of profound foolishness. By Friday, their design was complete. By Saturday night, they were arming a truck with bolt cutters, flashlights, and a Glock 17 that, given his history, Connor Hayes had no right to possess. Sarah, in her world, 60 miles and 7,000 feet away, knew nothing of the storm gathering on her horizon. She was living a life that would seem an impossible fiction to most 17-year-olds, but which had become the steady, quiet rhythm of her own reality. She rose with the dawn, coaxed the generator to life, and brewed coffee potent enough to peel paint. Her mornings were a communion with her parents' research notes, a daughter's quest to understand the legacy they had left behind. Her afternoons were a testament to survival, the swing of an axe into firewood, the careful tending of the water system, the maintenance of the solar panels her father had installed as a second heartbeat for the cabin. And as the sun began its gentle descent each evening, she would walk to the clearing's edge and leave a humble offering. Most often it was apples, sometimes a piece of jerky. And once, after she had successfully hunted a rabbit with the old Ruger her father had taught her to master, she had placed half the meat upon the great flat rock near the ancient Douglas fir, a silent, reverent gift. She never witnessed the guardian's silent visit, yet with the dawn's first light, her humble offering had always vanished, a communion unseen. The woods possessed a hush all their own, a quietude entirely separate from the stillness of empty rooms, a truth Sarah had come to understand in the long passage of 8 months. The cabin's silence was a hollow ache, the sound of places forsaken, heavy with the ghosts of voices that once filled the air, echoing in spaces where laughter had long since faded. But the forest's silence was a living, breathing thing. It was an ancient awareness that listened, that waited. It drew breath in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the wind, but everything to do with the immeasurable weight of centuries of life growing and fading and returning to the soil, long before humanity arrived with its steel and satellites, so certain of its dominion over mysteries it could never truly grasp. Her father had once tried to unveil this mystery to her on a late September evening when Sarah was just 14, as they sat on the porch bathed in the day's last golden light. "The old growth remembers," he had murmured, a statement she met with the casual disdain of youth, a roll of the eyes that felt as natural as breathing. But he persisted, undeterred, possessing the profound patience of a scholar, one at ease with the slow, deliberate pursuit of understanding. The trees speak to one another through a network of roots woven deep in the earth. They send warnings of encroaching insects, share their lifeblood with saplings that are not their own. We have only just begun to decipher their language. So when I say the forest remembers, I don't mean it as a poet might. I mean it holds a history, a living record in a language we have yet to learn. How Sarah ached for that moment back, wishing she had listened with her whole heart instead of losing herself in the margins of a notebook, her thoughts drifting to a boy in her biology class who likely never knew her name. But that is the cruel trick of youth, isn't it? You live as if time is an infinite ocean, believing the ones you love will always be standing on the shore, ready to answer the questions you haven't yet found the wisdom to ask. The tragedy arrived on a Tuesday, one of those deceptive spring days that whispers of warmth but delivers only a cold, relentless rain. Her parents had taken to the skies at dawn, their small plane charting a course north toward the Santiam wilderness, drawn by anomalous readings flickering from her mother's sensors. The flight plan was impeccably filed. The weather, while challenging, was deemed navigable. Marcus Thompson was a master of the air, with 3,000 hours logged. Linda Chen, his co-pilot in life and research, had graced those same skies for 15 years. At 11:43 in the morning, the radio fell silent. By 2 in the afternoon, when their absence had become a certainty, Sarah's call to the Forest Service was a prayer, against a gathering storm. By 4 in the afternoon, the sky was filled with the hum of search and rescue. For 9 days, they scoured the peaks and valleys. They found nothing. Not a sliver of a wing, not a whisper from the emergency locator. The Cascades are keepers of secrets. The mountains do not surrender what they claim unless they so choose. The official report was a tapestry of sterile words. Probable impact in remote terrain, recovery complicated by insurmountable topography and inclement weather. But the unofficial truth, the one delivered by a solemn Tyler Martinez as he stood on her porch in May, was a far simpler, crueler story. Sometimes, he told her, people just vanish into the green. Sometimes the wilderness simply wins. Sometimes there is no final chapter, no grave to visit, no last goodbye. There is only the hollow space where a life used to be. Sarah had offered a quiet nod, a thank you for the long drive up. The offer of coffee he gently refused. And when his truck had disappeared down the winding road, she walked deep into the forest until the cabin was but a memory, and she screamed a raw, tearing sound of a soul breaking until her throat was fire and ash. The ancient trees drank her sorrow, absorbing the sound just as they absorbed all things, the sun, the rain, the grief of a girl left alone. When the storm inside her had passed, leaving only an empty calm, she walked back. She started the generator, she made a meal, and she went to sleep, only to rise with the sun, determined to keep living because it's what they would have wanted, and because to surrender would be to lose them all over again. The weeks bled into months. Summer bloomed across the mountainside, a riot of wildflowers beneath endless days, its trails trodden by tourists who moved through this sacred land with no inkling they were guests in a kingdom far older than their GPS route. From the quiet shadows of the trees, Sarah would sometimes watch them, these confident people with their gleaming gear and loud voices, speaking of conquering peaks, as if the mountain were a thing to be defeated. She wondered if they could ever comprehend their own fragility, how little it would take for this great, sleeping giant to simply shrug them from its shoulders like a speck of dust. Her 17th birthday arrived with the heat of August, a day she marked in solitude. She baked a simple cake from a box mix, lit a single hopeful candle, and made a wish she knew the universe could not grant. Still, she blew it out, sending her impossible prayer into the quiet air. That night, the guardian left a gift upon the porch, railing a perfect white stone, as smooth and cool as river water. She carried it in her pocket from that day forward, a silent talisman, a tangible promise that in this vast and lonely wilderness, she was not entirely alone. September ushered the summer visitors back to their own worlds, returning the forest to its solemn self. October dusted the peaks with the season's first snow, and November was carrying Derek Callahan and his unwelcome questions up the mountain road, though Sarah, in her focused preparations for the coming winter, could not yet hear the approaching danger over the rhythm of her own survival. On the night they arrived, the wind was not a whisper but a roar, a furious spirit descending from the highest peaks as if it were fleeing some terrible darkness, or perhaps racing toward it. To conserve fuel, the generator was silent, leaving the small cabin awash in the warm, flickering glow of an old Coleman lantern, while the wood stove cast wild shadows that leaped and danced across the pine walls like restless phantoms. Sarah was lost in her mother's field notes, her fingers tracing the familiar script as she tried to translate the unique language Linda Chen had created, a delicate fusion of scientific observation and pure poetry. Subject observed at 23:40 hours. One entry read, approximate distance 150 meters. Behavior suggests recognition, not mere curiosity. Query, is the memory specific to us or a learned response to human presence? Query, if memory, how deep does it run? How many generations back? In the margin, a quick, powerful sketch gave form to the words a tall figure, its shoulders impossibly broad, its arms longer than any human's. Beneath it, her mother had written a simple, chilling question. The old one? As Sarah's finger traced the lines of the drawing, a new sound pierced the storm's symphony. It was not the wind, nor the groan of the cabin settling, nor the crackle of the fire. It was the sound of an engine, a mechanical growl tearing through the night, growing closer, the strained, grinding protest of a truck forcing its way up a mountain road. It was never meant to travel in such conditions. She closed the journal, the soft snap of the cover echoing in the sudden tension. She rose to her feet. Every instinct her parents had honed in her, a legacy woven into her very being, ignited at once. No one came this far up the mountain at night. No one dared this road in November. To be here now, in this storm, was an act born of desperation, or foolishness, or something far more sinister. Sarah moved like a shadow to the window, extinguishing the lantern's flame and plunging the room into near darkness. She watched. The truck's headlights sliced through the swirling snow 2 minutes later, bouncing erratically as they conquered the final, rugged stretch of road. The vehicle lurched to a halt in the clearing, its engine a low grumble, its beams pinning the cabin like a pair of accusatory fingers. 3 men emerged. In the blinding glare, their faces were lost to the shadows, but their forms were clear. They were large men, moving with an unnerving confidence. One of them spoke, his words devoured by the wind. Another let out a short, harsh laugh that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Then, together, they started for her door. Her hands moved with a wisdom older than her fear, her mind still catching up to the grim reality. She reached above the mantel and took down the shotgun, her father's old Remington. He had placed it in her hands when she was just 12, teaching her its weight and its purpose. She checked the chamber, the familiar, solid click, a small comfort. 2 shells, loaded with buckshot. A potent answer for any beast, 2-legged or 4, that meant her harm. When the knock came, it was a sharp, almost civilized sound against the storm's fury. 3 distinct raps. A breath of silence. Then a voice, warped by the wind and wood, but audible still. "Hello? Anyone home?" Sarah offered no reply. She remained a statue in the heart of her darkened cabin, the shotgun resting in hands that possessed a stillness that defied the terror in her heart, and she waited. Another knock. This one, more insistent. "We're not here to cause trouble," the voice called out. "Just need to ask some questions about Marcus Thompson, about what he might have left behind." And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. These men were not lost travelers seeking shelter. They hadn't stumbled upon her by chance. They had come for this place, for her, for the legacy her father had guarded. And their arrival under the cloak of a storm-racked night meant one thing. They had no intention of being seen. "Look," the voice outside continued, its attempt at a reasonable tone curdling into a clear threat. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Your choice." Sarah crept to the window again, keeping her silhouette low, and peered into the wind-whipped clearing. One was testing the doorknob, a patient, rhythmic turning. Another was circling the cabin's perimeter, his dark shape pausing at each window. The third, the speaker, stood in the stark light of the headlamps, his hands shoved in his pockets in a failed pantomime of ease. A desperate need for help, for a voice on the other end of a line, surged through her. But the landline, the cabin's single thread to the outside world, had been silent for 2 days. She had planned to hike down to the junction box, but the worsening weather had whispered for her to wait. It hadn't seemed urgent until this very second, when it was the most urgent thing in the world, and it was far too late. The sharp, violent shatter of breaking glass from the back bedroom was the only answer she would receive. They were coming in. Sarah moved with a sudden, fluid grace, the muscle memory from her father's endless drills overriding her fear. He had run her through scenarios just like this, ones she had dismissed at the time as the products of a paranoid mind. If someone comes and you can't get help, his voice echoed in her memory, "Don't try to fight 3 grown men. You're smart, Sarah. Use that." Her hands flew, grabbing her mother's precious journal, stuffing it deep inside her jacket. She snatched the emergency bag, always packed, always ready, and the keys to the truck. The back door. It was her only chance. If she moved now, in this sliver of time before they navigated the back room, before they stormed the main living space, she could make it. She could get to the truck, get down the mountain, get to help. She took 3 silent, desperate steps toward freedom before the front door exploded inward, a shower of splintered wood announcing that her time had just run out. The figure who breached the doorway was not a man of great size, but possessed a sinewy strength that spoke of a life carved from hardship, a resilience more fearsome than simple mass. A flashlight's beam cut a path from one hand, while the other held the grim silhouette of a pry bar. His eyes found her in the cloaking darkness, and a smile bloomed on his face. "There you are," his voice whispered, a sound that seemed to curl the very air around it. With hands that held the steadiness of winter ice, Sarah brought the shotgun to bear. His smile never faltered, a mask of chilling confidence. "You don't have the heart to pull that trigger." "Then I invite you to test its beat," she replied, her voice a sliver of steel. A girl of 17 years playing queen of a forgotten mountain, a defiant little ghost in the woods? He took a measured step closer. "Your father may have taught you how to point that weapon, but to unleash its fire, that is a sacrament, a crossing from which no soul returns unchanged." How profoundly wrong he was. Sarah had already walked across thresholds he could not dream of. She had conducted funerals for her parents in the quiet cathedral of her heart, with no bodies to mourn. She had survived for 8 solitary months on a peak that claimed the lives of seasoned men. She had stood on this very porch and felt the gaze of the impossible staring back. She had traversed so many final horizons that this next one felt like just another step on a long road. She answered him with thunder. The report in the small room was a physical blow, a deafening wave that stole all other sound. The man fell in a tangle of limbs and screams, clutching a leg torn asunder by the buckshot. She had aimed for the earth, not the heavens of prayer to stop, not to end, but he would not be rising. As his two accomplices burst from the back room, Sarah was already a phantom, melting through the front door and into the tempest's embrace. The cold struck her like a mailed fist. The wind drove the snow in horizontal sheets, a blizzard that flew sideways in the frigid teens, and each of her breaths was a fleeting white cloud, torn away by the gale. She ran for the sanctuary of the truck, keys in her hand, knowing she had but 30 seconds before the shock wore off and the hunt began anew. 20 seconds. The truck door, a frozen sentinel, was locked. Her fingers, already numb ghosts, fumbled with the key's delicate promise. 15 seconds. The key found the lock but would not yield, held fast by a secret frost within the mechanism. 10 seconds. She breathed a prayer of warm air onto the frozen metal and tried again. 5 seconds. The lock surrendered with a quiet click, a sound like salvation. The door swung open, and she threw herself into the cold darkness within. But the truck was a vessel of deep, lifeless cold, its battery a victim of the plunging temperature and her own human frailty. A litany of should-haves echoed in her soul. When she turned the key, the engine gave only a faint, metallic sigh. Once, twice, and then a profound and final silence. She lifted her eyes. The two men were emerging from the cabin, their flashlights carving wounds into the night. One now held a gun, his posture speaking a language that had moved far beyond questions. And so Sarah did the only thing that remained to her. She ran into the sanctuary of the forest, into the heart of the starless night, into the very teeth of the storm and the waiting arms of the trees, casting herself upon the mercy of whatever watched from beyond the circles of light. Behind her, like an inexorable fate, the men followed. The November forest at night was not merely an absence of light, but an absence of all that was known and safe. No moon graced the thick shroud of clouds. No stars offered their distant solace. There was only the pure white of the new-fallen snow and the profound black of everything else. And Sarah, a fleeting spirit running between them, her father's jacket, a prayer against the wind, her breath, a fire in her lungs. She knew these woods as she knew the lines on her own hands. She had walked them since she was a child of 8, first guided by her parents, then alone as she grew to trust the silent company of trees more than the voices of men. But to know a forest in the sun is a different scripture from knowing it in a blizzard at midnight, with hunters on your trail. This was a knowledge learned in the blood and bone. A terror-born wisdom that a single wrong step could lead to a broken ankle and a slow, cold fade into the snow. Their flashlight beams sliced through the trees behind her, a violation of the sacred dark. She could hear them crashing through the undergrowth with the discordance of the city, their voices sharp and loud as they tried to coordinate. They were not men of the woods. That much was plain. They moved as if the forest were merely an obstacle between paved roads. This gave her an advantage, but a fragile one. They had light, they had weapons, and they had each other. She had only the darkness, her own stark terror, and a wild, rising strength she could not yet name. The wind moved through the ponderosa pines with the sound of a distant ocean, of waves breaking on a shore that existed only in memory. Sarah let it become her cloak, timing her movements to the symphony of the gusts, becoming as still as stone when the wind held its breath. It was a lesson her father had whispered to her long ago. Sound is a traitor in the still air. Wait for the wind. Let the mountain hide you. She journeyed 200 yards before her body cried for respite, and she pressed herself against the rough, ancient bark of a Douglas fir, gasping for air that felt like swallowing ice. Her legs were a trembling memory of strength. Her hands were lost to the cold. She had fled her home with only the clothes on her back, her mother's journal, a sacred text in her pocket, and a terror so complete it felt like drowning on the driest land. The beams of light swept past her hiding place, perhaps 50 yards to her left. She heard one of them curse the darkness, and the other speak of splitting up a fool's gambit in these woods, on this night, in this storm. But she would not be their guide. Let them learn for themselves what the mountain does to those who offer it no respect. She waited until their passage was a fading echo, then began to move again, climbing now toward the old-growth forest her father had called the cathedral. Here, the trees grew so ancient and dense that even the midday sun had to fight to touch the ground. Giants that were 400 years old or more, silent witnesses to settlers and to the first peoples who hunted these hills with prayers and points of stone. The ground grew steeper here, a treacherous slope of pine needles made slick with snow. She clawed her way upward, branch by branch, feeling the righteous burn in her thighs and shoulders. Behind her, the voices were growing fainter, swallowed by the storm or their own confusion. Neither was a comfort. A lost man is a desperate one, and desperation is a dangerous compass. Upon cresting a small ridge, she paused as the landscape resolved into a familiar map in her mind. The cathedral was just ahead, 100 yards of sanctuary, and beyond it, memory whispered of an old logging road, abandoned since the 1980s, a forgotten scar on the mountain. If she could reach that road, it was a 7 or 8 mile path to the Forest Service station at Wickiup Junction. She could reach it by dawn, if she could just keep going. If the cold did not take her first, if her lungs did not surrender, if the men finally gave up their hunt, if only. And in that suspended moment, a new sound reached her, a whisper that belonged neither to the pursuing men nor the sighing wind. It was a presence in the trees to her right, a shadow keeping a parallel, patient pace, a heavy, deliberate rhythm, the sharp retort of a branch far too thick to yield to mere chance, the soft cascade of snow displaced from low-hanging boughs by something of immense size passing beneath. A stillness took hold of Sarah, a cold that seeped deeper than the winter air. Her hand, a trembling bird, sought the solace of her jacket pocket, finding the smooth white stone and clenching it until the sharp edges bit into her palm. The movement beside her ceased. She held her breath, counting the silent heartbeats that stretched into 5 seconds, then 10, then 15 eternities. And then a voice, not a sound but a resonance, bloomed directly behind her, so intimately close she could feel the vibration of the words like a warm breath upon the nape of her neck. Keep moving. She whirled around, a frantic pirouette of fear, only to find an emptiness woven from trees and encroaching darkness, where the wind sculpted sounds that could be anything and nothing at all. Yet, she knew. She knew the timbre of that voice, the profound depth of it. She knew it was neither human nor beast. It was the same voice her father had spoken of once, in the hushed hours of a long night, his words loosened by whiskey and the heavy burden of years spent guarding a secret. It spoke to me once, he had confessed, his gaze lost in memory, not in words as we know them, but I understood. The forest has a soul, and it speaks to those who learn how to listen. And so Sarah moved, propelled now by a current of instinct she never knew she possessed. The cathedral of trees opened its arms to her, and even in the profound dark, she could feel its essence, a sense of immense space, of ancient age, of a sanctity that owed nothing to the churches or prayers or any fragile thing conceived by man. The trees here were titans, their trunks wider than her childhood bedroom, their lowest branches beginning some 50 feet above, where the first whispers of a canopy knitted the sky together. Here, the snow never touched the forest floor, caught instead in a high, intricate ceiling of needles and wood. A hallowed quietude reigned here as well. The wind, a restless spirit outside, could not penetrate this deep sanctuary. The sounds of her pursuers dissolved into the profound stillness. Her own breathing seemed a profanity in the silence, too loud, too fragile, a testament to her vulnerability. She pressed her body against one of the ancient trunks, feeling the rough, living bark against her cheek, and granted herself the grace of 5 stolen seconds of rest. It was in the space of that 5th second that a profane spear of light found her. There! The cry shattered the sacred calm, a jagged sound hurled from perhaps 70 yards behind her, down the long, dark slope. I see her! Sarah Chen. All strategy dissolved, all clever woodcraft forgotten, leaving only the pure electric current of animal panic. She plunged through the heart of the cathedral, a desperate blur weaving between the colossal trunks, her boots finding fleeting purchase on exposed roots and stones cloaked in moss. Behind her, the men crashed in her wake, their flashlights carving wild, frantic arcs through the gloom as they battled the ancient, unforgiving terrain. She carved another 50 yards from the darkness before her foot betrayed her, ensnared by a root, a rock, or perhaps the sheer weight of her own exhaustion, and she fell hard. Her chin struck the unyielding earth, her teeth clacking with a sound like shattering porcelain as a bright nova of pain exploded behind her eyes. She tasted the warm, metallic tang of blood. Rolling onto her back, she had just enough time to see the beams of their lights converging, pinning her like a captured moth. The chase had ended. The world had shrunk to this one breathless moment of capture. They emerged from the surrounding shadows like apparitions, their breathing ragged, their flashlights aimed at her face, erasing the world in a glare of white. One of them held the gun, a blocky, automatic thing that seemed a brutal intrusion in his hand. The other, the one whose voice had first violated the cabin's peace, hung back, struggling to reclaim his breath. That, he managed to gasp, the words torn from his lungs, was stupid, Really goddamn stupid. Sarah remained silent, her mind a whirlwind of cold calculation, weighing distances and angles, wondering if her body could rise and fly once more before a bullet could find its home. The grim arithmetic did not favor her. Where is it? The man with a gun, a young man named Brandon, though she did not yet know his name, stepped closer, his voice a greedy whisper. The insurance money, the research data, whatever treasure your parents squirreled away up here. There is nothing, Sarah heard herself say, the voice a strange, calm river flowing from a source outside her fear. They were biologists. They didn't have money. Bullshit. She saw that Brandon's hand was trembling, the gun's aim unsteady. He was afraid, she realized with a sudden, chilling clarity, perhaps more afraid than she was. And she knew that frightened people were the authors of the most terrible mistakes. Your old man was charting courses all over these mountains. Someone had to be paying him. He had to be documenting something worth a fortune. He was mapping the secret lives of the forest creatures. That was his only treasure. Then explain the high-priced gear. Explain why your mother held a government clearance. Don't you dare feed me lies. A laugh, bitter and wild, almost escaped her. Government clearance. Her mother had accepted a small contract with the Forest Service, conducting basic habitat surveys, work as classified as the changing of the seasons. But in their minds, these men had woven a grand and glittering fantasy, convinced themselves of a king's ransom hidden in her parents' humble cabin, and had charged up a mountain in a blizzard to claim a prize that was nothing but smoke and shadow. She opened her mouth to offer them the truth, to speak the words that might anchor them to reason, to do anything that might purchase her enough time to see the dawn. But the words were never born, for in that moment the ancient heart of the forest itself began to stir. The world shifted in a heartbeat. One moment, Brandon stood before her, his finger tightening on the trigger, weighing the value of her life. The next, he was screaming, lifted from his feet by a force that moved like a ripple in the fabric of the night, too swift for their beams of light to follow. His gun barked a single, futile protest, its muzzle flash painting a fleeting, useless portrait of the trees, and then he was simply gone, pulled back into the waiting darkness with a velocity that defied all known laws. The other man, Connor, the one who had seen the inside of a cage, the one who should have understood the nature of predators, spun in a panic, his flashlight slashing wildly through the air, a desperate search for his vanished friend. Brandon? Brandon! There was no answer, only the sigh of the wind in the high canopy and a sound like breathing, a respiration deep and slow and seeming to come from everywhere at once. Connor's questing beam of light finally snagged upon something at the very edge of its reach, a shape, a form, impossibly tall, standing sentinel between two of the ancient trees, one massive hand resting gently on bark that must have been 3 feet thick. The light was a poor servant, revealing no details, but Sarah could perceive its general form. 8 feet tall, perhaps more. Shoulders that seemed hewn from the mountain's own granite, arms that hung longer than any human arms should ever reach. And a face, mercifully veiled by the darkness, save for 2 distant points of reflected light that could have been eyes, or could have been twin, fallen stars. The fragile vessel of Connor's courage shattered. He turned and fled, abandoning his light, abandoning Brandon, abandoning all pretense of the hard man he imagined himself to be. He made it perhaps 10 yards into the gloom before the forest reached for him. Sarah heard the sickening impact, heard the air rush from Connor's lungs in a final, explosive sigh, heard the heavy sound of his body meeting the earth, and then there was only silence. By all rights, terror should have claimed her. Every fiber of her rational mind screamed for her to run, to scream, to succumb to the panic that was her due. But she did not. For the being in the darkness, the guardian, the ancient one her parents had known and revered and ultimately left her to it, was no longer concerned with Connor or with Brandon. Its gaze, ancient and profound, was fixed entirely upon her. It took a single, deliberate step forward, crossing the threshold into the pale circle of light cast by the fallen flashlight. And in that moment, Sarah beheld it, truly saw it for the very first time. She saw the russet fur, a tapestry woven with ice and pine needle. She saw a face that echoed humanity, a visage that might have been human long ago, perhaps the very mold from which humankind was cast, or a forgotten memory of what we once were. And she saw the eyes, glowing like amber in the beam, brimming with a profound intelligence that made her heart ache with a startling sense of familiarity. Her father's words echoed in her soul. He had been right. The forest did indeed remember. And its memory stood before her now, a living chronicle breathing plumes of frost into the chilled November air, regarding her with the ancient patience of a being that had watched the ages of man rise and fall, and would watch countless more. "Thank you," Sarah breathed. The words a hushed prayer on the frozen air. The guardian inclined its head, a gesture so profoundly human it pierced her heart. Then it turned and moved away, without haste or stealth, simply melting back into the woods like a weary soul returning home at dusk. Within 5 paces, it vanished, consumed by the shadows, the distance, and the staggering impossibility of its own existence. For a long, suspended minute, Sarah remained on the forest floor, her gaze fixed on the empty space it had occupied, her mind struggling to weave the threads of what had just transpired. Connor's groans from the darkness confirmed he was alive, though certainly regretting it. Brandon was a silence punctuated by the faint rhythm of breath from where he'd been taken. Not gone from this world, then. Merely given a permanent, painful lesson in the art of respecting powers far beyond their comprehension. She rose with deliberate slowness, every fiber of her being crying out in protest. Her fingers found the fallen flashlight, and she tested her ankle with a cautious shift of weight, a sprain, not a break, a pain she could endure. She began the long walk back, retracing her steps toward the promise of the cabin, toward warmth, toward sanctuary, and toward a life that had now claimed her, with or without her consent. The men would have to find their own way down from the mountain. If wisdom found them, they would flee this place and never return. If it did not, well, the forest possessed its own unique curriculum for those who were slow to learn. An hour later, she reached the cabin, a tremor racking her body so violently her teeth ached. The front door hung agape, a wounded mouth where they had forced their way in. The man she had shot, Derek, a name she had yet to learn, had vanished, leaving behind a crimson trail that marked his pained retreat to the truck. The vehicle itself was gone, having carried away the last vestiges of the 3 men's manufactured courage. Sarah slipped inside, dragging the heavy dresser from her parents' room to barricade the fractured door. She coaxed a fire to life in the old wood stove, its warmth a fragile promise. After changing into dry clothes, she attempted to make tea, her hands trembling so fiercely that she spilled half the water. Finally, she sat at the kitchen table, her mother's journal open before her, searching its pages for an anchor in this bewildering new reality. A guardian dwelled in these woods. This was the truth she now held. Her parents had known of it, had offered it their protection, had forged some sacred pact that Sarah was only now beginning to fathom. And this guardian, this ancient being, had just saved her life, stepping from the shadows when 3 armed men came to do her harm, valuing her safety above its own sacred secrecy. Why? She opened the journal to a page at random, her mother's familiar script blurring before her exhausted eyes. Marcus believes there is a bond, not merely with us, but with certain bloodlines. As if it recognizes a genetic echo, some ancestral marker passed down unknowingly through generations. The native tribes have legends of this. The Malala people spoke of the Old Ones, beings who were here before the first humans and will remain long after the last. They said these beings chose certain families to watch over, certain souls who carried the ancient ways deep within their bones. Sarah's fingers closed around the smooth, white stone in her pocket. Her mind drifted to her father's fireside stories, her mother's tireless research, the decades they had dedicated to a creature that science decreed impossible. She recalled the humble offerings they left, the profound respect they always showed, and the quiet, unwavering faith that they were not alone, that something ancient watched over them from the deep woods. And in that moment, clarity bloomed within her. This was never about money or research or anything so beautifully simple. This was a covenant of trust. Her parents had proven their worth, had shown the guardian that humanity could be an ally, not just a threat. And now, that sacred trust was a mantle passed to her, a profound responsibility, a solemn privilege, and a heavy burden, all intertwined. She gently closed the journal. She finished her tea, watching the fire surrender its light and heat, collapsing into glowing embers. And when sleep finally claimed her, she dreamt of walking through the forest cathedral at high noon, sunlight dappling through the needles of 400-year-old trees, and a voice that was not quite human spoke to her in a language that was not quite words, whispering that she was home, that she was safe, that she would never be alone again. The morning arrived, reluctantly, draped in a shroud of gray. Sarah awoke to a body that felt alien, stiff and adorned with bruises she couldn't recall earning, her ankle swollen to twice its natural size. She bound it tightly, swallowed some expired ibuprofen from the medicine cabinet, and began to limp through the cabin, taking stock of the damage. The front door would have to be replaced. The window in the back bedroom cried out to be boarded. A stain of blood marred the floorboards, not a great deal, but enough to occupy her for an hour with bleach and hot water. As she finished her task, the sun made a valiant effort to pierce the clouds, and then she heard it. The sound she had been anticipating. An engine, its growl climbing the mountain road. For a heart-stopping moment, fear seized her. What if they had returned? What if they brought more men? But this engine's voice was different, deeper, authoritative. And as the vehicle emerged into the clearing, she recognized the familiar Forest Service green and the silent promise of the light bar on its roof. Sheriff Tyler Martinez was the first to emerge, his 6'2" frame unfolding from the driver's seat. At 63, he had worn the sheriff's star for 20 years and had known her parents long before Sarah had drawn her first breath. His face was a landscape weathered like old leather, his hair a shock of silver white beneath his hat, and his eyes held the quiet depth of a man who had seen too much to be startled, yet still held a reservoir of kindness for those who had earned it. From the passenger side came Jake Williams. He was 68 and technically retired from the Forest Service, but he answered the call whenever they needed a man who knew these mountains as intimately as his own skin. He had been her father's dearest friend, the mentor who had taught Sarah how to track elk, to read the sky's intentions, and to endure in a wilderness that was unforgiving to the unprepared. "Sarah," Tyler said, his gaze taking in the map of her bruises, her swollen ankle, the violated door, "tell me everything that happened here." And so she told them. She recounted the entire ordeal, the shattering intrusion, the desperate flight through the woods, the deafening report of the gun. But she withheld a single sacred detail. She did not speak of her savior. Some secrets, she now knew, belonged to the forest, and she was its keeper. Tyler listened with a solemn stillness, his expression hardening with every word she spoke. When her story concluded, he remained silent for a long moment before giving a slow nod. 3 men checked into the Pine Lodge 5 days ago. Derek Callahan, Connor Hayes, and Brandon Walsh. Hayes has a history. Callahan was seen asking questions around town. We were watching them, but we didn't have anything solid enough to act on. They came here searching for money, Sarah explained. A phantom insurance payout they believed my parents had left behind. And was there any? No. They owned a 30-year-old truck and scientific equipment they'd purchased secondhand. Any money they ever had was poured back into their research, not into savings accounts. Meanwhile, Jake was walking the perimeter, his eyes reading the story written on the earth the way other men read a book. He paused at the edge of the woods, his gaze fixed on something for a long while before he returned. "There are a lot of tracks out here," he murmured, "and some of them are quite interesting." Tyler met his friend's gaze, and a silent conversation passed between 2 men who had shared a lifetime of understanding. He then turned his attention back to Sarah. "Those men never made it off the mountain. We found their truck about 3 miles down, wrapped around a tree. It appears the driver lost control. All 3 were inside, banged up but alive. They were rambling, talking nonsense about being attacked by something. We chalked it up to the storm, maybe a head injury from the crash." Sarah remained silent, letting the unspoken truth hang in the air. "The thing is," Tyler went on, his tone measured, "there's evidence of some highly unusual activity in this area. We found large tracks in the snow, signs that something massive moved through these woods, and the men's injuries, they don't quite align with a simple car crash. The bruising patterns look more like, well, like grip marks, as if something immense picked them up and simply tossed them aside." And still, a profound silence was Sarah's only reply. A weary sigh escaped Tyler's lips, a gentle mist in the cold air. "Your father and I, we shared words once. A lifetime ago, it seems, long before you graced this world. He spoke of things that, by the book, I'm sworn to dismiss, yet in my heart, unofficially. I hold them as truth, for I've walked these mountains long enough to know their soul holds more secrets than any wildlife management textbook could ever contain." And what secrets did he share? Sarah's voice was a whisper, fragile as a falling leaf. He spoke of a sacred duty, that some things in this world simply deserve our protection, that the ancient heart of this forest is not merely a collection of trees, elk, and spotted owls, that beings dwell here for whom we have no names, no neat categories, creatures that were ancient when our kind first arrived and will remain long after our dust has settled, and that the greatest wisdom we can offer them is the grace of our absence. From the splintered threshold where he knelt, examining the door's grievous wounds, Jake's voice rose, steady and sure. "You'll need a hand to mend this place, to brace it against the coming winter. I can make my way up this weekend, bring the necessary materials." "I have money to pay," Sarah began, her words a hesitant offering. Payment was never part of the question. The question was if you needed help. Jake's tone was as unyielding as the mountain granite. "Your father lent his strength to help me raise my own cabin back in '86. It is long past time I returned such a kindness." Tyler inclined his head in solemn agreement. "And I'm stationing a deputy at the foot of your road for a few weeks' time. A guardian at the gate until we are certain those three have understood the message. Officially, it's for the protection of a witness. But between us, it's because you are 17 years old, living in this solitude, and that truth does not rest easy upon my soul. I am more than capable of taking care of myself, Sarah insisted, her voice regaining a sliver of its familiar steel. Of that, I have no doubt. You proved that with fire and courage last night. But it is a burden you should not have to bear alone. Tyler's hand came to rest on her shoulder, a touch so gentle it might have been meant for his own grandchildren. Before their last flight, your parents entrusted me with a promise, a sacred vow that if the unthinkable were to happen, I would see to it that you were safe. I fear I have not honored that vow well these past months. Allow me to do better now. A subtle fissure traced its way across Sarah's heart, not a shattering, but a delicate crack, allowing a sliver of light to pierce a darkness she hadn't known she was dwelling in. For so long, she had carried the weight of the world upon her own shoulders, believing strength was a fortress built of solitude. But perhaps true strength was also found in accepting a helping hand, in allowing those who had loved her parents to help carry the legacy of their love. "Kay," she breathed, the word a quiet surrender. A warm, genuine smile blossomed on Tyler's face. "Good. Now, let's see to this door and get some real nourishment into you. You have the look of someone who has been subsisting on nothing but ramen noodles and sheer defiance." "That is a remarkably accurate assessment of my life," Sarah conceded with the ghost of a smile. And so the three of them worked, a quiet symphony of restoration as the morning sun climbed the sky. Tyler braced the violated door while Jake meticulously boarded the shattered window. Sarah, though slowed by the ache in her ankle, moved with purpose, brewing coffee and making sandwiches. They did not speak of the impossible tracks etched in the snow, but instead wove a tapestry of the ordinary, of the coming winter's predicted fury, of the Blazers' chances in the playoffs, and of Jake's beloved granddaughter applying to colleges. These were the gentle rhythms of a normal human life, a conversation that tethered Sarah back to the world, a reminder that she belonged to it, even as she had become a citizen of something far older. As noon cast its gentle light, the sound of an approaching truck rumbled up the road. Tyler's hand instinctively fell to his sidearm, but relaxed as the familiar vehicle came into view. Emma Rodriguez pulled into the clearing, emerging with a covered dish that radiated a scent like a memory of heaven. At 57, she ran the town diner and had been a kindred spirit to Sarah's mother since forever. "I heard the mountain was whispering of trouble," Emma declared, marching toward the cabin with the unassailable confidence of family. "So I brought you carnitas, and rice, and beans, and fresh tortillas, because my heart told me you've been eating nothing but sorrow." Despite the ache in her soul, a genuine smile found its way to Sarah's lips. "You didn't have to do that. Child, this wasn't about having to. This was about wanting to. Now, you sit yourself down and let me put some life back into you before the next breeze carries you away." And so they ate. The four of them gathered together, and in that simple act, it felt like the truest definition of family. Not the family born of blood that she had lost, but the kind that is forged in choice, where showing up matters more than lineage, and where love arrives in the form of carnitas for a frightened child on a lonely mountain. When at last they departed, leaving behind promises to return, promises to call, and Tyler's personal number on his card, Sarah stood on the porch, watching their taillights fade. The wind was a gentle caress, the chimes sang a soft lullaby, and the forest felt less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary. She made her way to the clearing's edge, to the smooth, flat rock that served as an altar between worlds. Upon it, she placed an apple and one of Emma's tortillas, still radiating a gentle warmth. She stood there for a long moment, bathed in the afternoon sun, feeling watched, but this time with a sense of benevolence, not threat. "Thank you," she whispered once more. Her voice carried to the forest, to the guardian, to the ancient heart of whatever listened. "For honoring your promise," the wind answered, shifting to bring her a scent of pine and rich earth, and something more ancient than any name. And while she saw nothing, felt no tangible touch, a profound certainty settled deep within her bones. Her gratitude had been received. The sacred pact her parents had woven into this land would endure. She was protected, not by any deed she had done, but because trust, once freely given, was a gift the old ones did not lightly cast aside. Returning to the cabin's embrace, she kindled a fire and settled at the kitchen table with her mother's journal. Countless pages still lay waiting, a legacy of years filled with observations and whispered questions. She had time now, an entire winter, as the snow would narrow her world to the cabin, the forest, and the quiet work of learning what her parents had spent a lifetime seeking to understand. In the world below, the men who had violated her sanctuary attempted to press charges, spinning a wild tale of being lured and ambushed by some trained beast. The district attorney nearly laughed them out of his office. Tyler's report was a bastion of clarity. Home invasion, attempted robbery, self-defense. Yes, Sarah had fired her weapon, but only after her home had been breached, and she had aimed to wound, not to kill. As for their fantastical stories, well, head injuries could play tricks on a man's memory, and those mountains were full of bears. In the end, the charges were unceremoniously dropped. Connor Hayes was returned to prison on a parole violation. Derek Callahan hobbled back to California, forever silent about the shadows of Oregon. And Brandon Walsh simply vanished. Some whispered he fled to Alaska, others that he sought therapy. None of them ever dared to set foot on Waseda Mountain again. December arrived, cloaked in white, bringing with it the deep, silencing snows. Her road, as she had always known it would, became impassable. But Jake had helped her provision the cabin, teaching her the old tricks for preserving warmth, ensuring she had all she needed to endure until the spring thaw. She felt no fear, for the forest, she knew, took care of its own. And with the dawn of each new day, she would find quiet miracles. The woodpile miraculously replenished with fallen timber, the cabin roof mysteriously cleared of snow's immense weight. And once, after a ferocious storm, a deer carcass appeared near her door, a fresh kill, its warmth still clinging to it, a perfect gift for making jerky to see her through to March. She left offerings of gratitude, tokens of a silent communion, each one chosen with a reverent heart. Smoked salmon, a treasure she'd bartered for in town before the winter sealed the road shut. Golden honey, spun from the labor of Emma's bees. And once, on a Christmas shrouded in snow, a whole apple pie, its warmth a ghost of her mother's own hands, baked from a recipe held like scripture. And by the first light of morning, every trace of her offering would have vanished into the forest's deep embrace. The winter unfurled its long, dark cloak, passing with the deliberate slowness known only to those who dwell in solitude, where the night arrives early and lingers like a held breath. Sarah lost herself in the pages of her mother's journal, absorbing decades of quiet devotion. She learned the sacred rhythms the guardian kept, the ancient territories it roamed, the subtle sigils it left to mark its passage. She came to understand there were likely others. The journal spoke in whispers of prints in varied sizes, hinting at a hidden family, a community woven into the fabric of the wild. She discovered her mother's profound belief that they were the last of their kind, survivors from a forgotten age. They were a fragile echo of something once more plentiful, now withdrawn to the deep, hallowed places where the footfalls of man were a rarity. Their existence was an endangered secret, one that could never be entrusted to wildlife services or conservation programs, for to acknowledge them would be to condemn them. The world would descend upon them, scientists, hunters, the curious and the cruel. And the last of the old ones would be unraveled by the same human impulse that had unraveled so much of the world the ravenous need to know, to classify, to possess. And so, Sarah's parents had held their secret like a sacred vow. They had chronicled in whispers, protected with a silent ferocity, and passed this profound responsibility to their daughter, a legacy bestowed without a single question of her consent. Yet no anger bloomed in her heart. In its place, a deep and resonant understanding. She knew that some knowledge is a weight to be carried, but it is also a rare privilege. To be trusted with a truth so monumental meant her life was etched with a purpose beyond mere survival. It meant she was a thread in a tapestry far grander than herself. It meant the grief that had threatened to drown her since the crash now had a riverbed to flow through, a direction to move other than inward, consuming her heart. By the time February's pale light touched the snow, a new strength had taken root within her. The very isolation that should have fractured her spirit had instead unearthed the unyielding bedrock of her soul. She kept the cabin breathing, kept the fire of her own life fed and warm, and held fast to the faith that spring would keep its promise, bringing with it the dawn of whatever her life was destined to become. March arrived as a promise fulfilled. The snow began its slow, graceful retreat, and the road, a lifeline to the world below, finally surrendered its icy grip. The first vessel to brave the mountain pass was Tyler Martinez in his sheriff's cruiser, carrying with him the winds of change. The insurance company finally came through, he said, his voice a gentle intrusion in the cabin's quiet, as he sat at her kitchen table cradling a cup of coffee she had learned to brew strong enough to stir ghosts. Your parents' policy. It isn't a king's ransom, but it's enough to claim this cabin as your own, to give you a few years of breathing room while you finish your schooling. School. Sarah breathed a word, and it hung in the air like a ghost from another life. A life where a girl her age should be lost in the orbit of SATs and college essays and the sweet, fleeting worry of a prom date. Instead, her world was one of property taxes, the hum of a generator, and the cold calculus of whether she had enough ammunition for the next shadow that might fall upon her door. Online school, Tyler clarified, his voice a bridge between her two worlds. I spoke with the district. They'll let you earn your diploma from right here. And I reached out to Oregon State. They have a wildlife biology program, one that would let you do most of the learning online and just come down for labs when the mountain allows. Sarah blinked, the sheer kindness of his act a light almost too bright to behold. Why would you do all that? Because you're 17 and brilliant as they come, and living on a mountain shouldn't mean your world has to shrink? Tyler's voice was a soft current, yet it carried the unshakable force of conviction. Your parents would want you to have choices. They'd want you to be able to choose this life with your whole heart, not be trapped in it by circumstance. I already chose it. Her voice was quiet, but it held the mountain's own unyielding certainty. Then prove it by seeing this through. Earn the degree. Learn what they learned, but from a new vantage. Do what they did, but better, because you'll have the foundation of real training, not just the courage of piecing it together. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. And because I made them a promise that if the unthinkable ever happened, I'd make sure you had a future. This is me, Sarah, keeping that promise. Sarah let his words settle, imagining the path he had laid before her, a path of spending the next 4 years in formal study of the very wildness she had already come to know in her soul. A path to consecrating her parents' work, giving it the language of academia, making it something that could endure beyond the fragile vessel of her own memory. A path toward earning credentials that might, one day, grant her the power to shield this sacred place in ways that mattered to a world that demanded degrees and documents before it would ever listen. Okay, she said at last. The word a quiet surrender and a fierce declaration. But I'm staying here. I'm not moving to Corvallis or anywhere else. This is my home. A knowing smile touched Tyler's lips. I figured as much. I already told the school you were a special case. They understand. And so it was that Sarah Chen, at 17 years of age, guardian of a secret far older than any map, enrolled in an online high school and began to weave a future that honored the tapestry of her past. She immersed herself in biology, ecology, and conservation, learning the clinical language scientists used to describe the profound truths she already knew in her very bones. She earned her high school diploma at 18, began her college journey at 19, and through it all, she remained on Waseda Mountain, a steadfast sentinel, faithful to the trust her parents had so carefully built. The years flowed by, as they do in wild places, measured not by the turning of calendar pages, but by the turning of seasons, by the faithful return of migrating birds, and the tender greening of ancient trees. Sarah blossomed from a 17-year-old girl into a 22-year-old woman, the softness of youth receding from her face, her hands growing, calloused from labor, her eyes taking on the profound depth of one who has witnessed things that can never be unseen. She never again saw the Guardian with such clarity, but its presence was a constant, a truth felt more deeply than seen. She knew it was there from the tracks that would materialize like apparitions in a fresh blanket of snow. She knew it from the palpable shift in the forest's energy as she walked through it, a feeling not of being watched, but of being watched over. And she knew it from the offerings that vanished and the gifts that appeared in their place, river-smooth stones, iridescent feathers, and once, on the dawn of her 21st birthday, a perfect, luminous white elk antler, a relic from a creature more myth than real in these mountains. She completed her degree in wildlife biology, a testament to her dual existence. She then embarked on a master's program, her focus on elusive species and the delicate dance of human-wildlife coexistence. Her thesis advisor never fully grasped why Sarah so adamantly refused to employ camera traps within her research area, but she respected it as an unshakable boundary. Some researchers had their ethical lines. Sarah's were simply carved more deeply into the earth. On her 23rd birthday, Tyler Martinez once again made the journey up the winding mountain road, his cruiser a familiar sight against the wild landscape. He was retiring, he announced, a man of 69 years who was finally ready to trade, chasing down troubles for the quiet pursuit of fishing. But before he turned in his badge, he had set one final, crucial thing in motion. He had succeeded in having the land surrounding Sarah's cabin designated as a special protection zone, 5,000 acres of old-growth forest, now a sanctuary, off limits to the blades of logging, the scars of mining, and the march of development. The official document spoke of endangered spotted owls and the preservation of a sensitive watershed. But the truth was a promise kept, a silent covenant honored for two departed biologists and their daughter who had become the forest's own voice in a world that had long forgotten how to listen. "It's not forever," Tyler cautioned, his words a gentle anchor of reality. "These designations can be challenged, but it buys you 20 years minimum. And that's time for you to find the next way forward." Sarah embraced him then, this man who had been more kin than friend, who had held his word like a compass when it would have been so much easier to lose his way. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder, "for everything." "Thank your parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They did the hard work. I just filled out the paperwork." He departed that afternoon, and as his cruiser disappeared down the mountain, Sarah walked out to the Cathedral of Trees to share the news with the only other soul who could truly comprehend its meaning. She stood among those ancient sentinels, 400 years old and still reaching for the heavens, and felt the immense weight of time settle upon her, not as a burden, but as a profound and comforting embrace. "We did it," she said, her voice a soft murmur to the listening silence. "They're safe. You're safe. For a while longer at least." The wind stirred through the high branches, and on its breath it carried a sound that might have been the groaning of ancient wood, or perhaps it might have been something else entirely. A low, resonant note of acknowledgement, a whisper of gratitude carried on the air. Sarah lingered as the sun bled into the horizon, her gaze lost in the way light cascaded through needles that had sifted sunbeams long before her nation was born, before the very idea of nations took root, before humanity ever laid claim to the earth. And in that quiet gloaming, a truth bloomed within her, a profound understanding she now shared with the parents she had lost. This ancient wood had no need for humankind to endure, but perhaps humanity desperately needed the forest to recall a forgotten wisdom that some things demand protection not for their utility, their profit, or even their beauty, but for the simple, sacred fact of their being. Because they were the first inhabitants. Because certain vows once whispered become the very marrow of your soul, the framework upon which a life is built. She made her way back to the cabin as twilight deepened into night, the wind chimes singing their crystalline hymn, and deep within the trees, a presence stirred through the shadows, an echo of the world in its primordial state. And Sarah Chen, at 23 years of age, shouldering a legacy that would shape all her days to come, felt a gentle smile grace her lips. For in this place she had found her sanctuary. In this wilderness, she was secure. And in this silence, she was never truly by herself. And the forest, as it had for 400 years, for 4,000 years, for all the eons that forests have breathed upon this earth, honored its silent covenant, to bear witness, to stand guard, to hold the memories that humankind so carelessly let slip away. Some things, she mused, were worthy of a lifetime's vigil, worthy of the solitude, the quiet sacrifices, and the profound secret that now lived deep within the marrow of her being. Some things, she knew, were worth becoming a guardian to protect. She stepped inside, coaxing a fire to life in the hearth and steeping a cup of tea. Tomorrow, her work on the thesis would begin. Tomorrow, she would take up the mantle of her parents' careful documentation. Tomorrow, she would continue to weave the tapestry of knowledge that might, one day, offer the ancient ones a shield far stronger than secrecy alone. But for tonight, she simply settled by the fire, allowing the gravity of her new duty to settle upon her shoulders like a mantle. It was a heavy weight, to be sure, but it was a weight she had chosen. And in that choice, it transformed from a burden into a purpose. It became the answer to that universal, whispered question of the soul, what is my reason for being? She was here for this. For the whispering woods and its silent sentinel, for the delicate cultivation of a trust that spanned species, that bridged generations, that stretched across the vast and breathtaking terror of existence itself, in a world still brimming with mystery. The fire danced and whispered its secrets, the wind sang its ancient lullaby through the eaves. And somewhere in the profound darkness, a pair of amber eyes blinked slowly a single time before turning to resume their silent patrol along the sacred line between the wild and the world of man, keeping each safe from the other, as it had always been, and as it would forever be if Sarah Chen now had any say in the matter.